Thank you all for coming on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of the summer. I'm Seth Goldstein. I'm the founder of Bright Moments. Really thrilled to have you here, Matt DesLauriers.
Thanks for coming to this little session. I'm Matt. I'm an artist, creative coder. I've been doing generative art for several years now. I've been really interested in it, and it's always been kind of this like strong passion of mine. So in the last couple of years, as it's been just kind of exploding into public consciousness, it's been pretty amazing to see. And now it's really kind of thrilling to actually have this opportunity with you guys, Bright Moments, to be able to put on kind of a show of my own making in London. So I live here in London. Last 4 years I've been living here, but before that I was in Canada, born in Toronto. And yeah, I'm really excited to be showing you guys later tonight or after this session what I've put together for Folio. It's kind of a one-of-a-kind project for me, and it's been a huge sort of endeavor as well. It's been just a lot of work and a lot of pushing kind of the work that I've been doing over the last several years into a slightly new direction, I'd say, a little bit more of like a spatial activation. It's really nice to actually have the opportunity to just have like carte blanche on a space, and Bright Moments has kind of been facilitating that, so thanks.
We were hanging projectors late last night, so it's still coming together.
Yeah, it's been a late night last night, but
there's still work going on over there, so that's why we're happy we're here.
Yeah.
So people can finish. Why don't we just start with your creative process? Like how do you work? What are some of your rituals? When do you code? How do you code? Let's start there. Yeah,
so it's kind of like a weird spontaneous thing where I'll go through like months where I'll just be really, really, really focused on creating work and it's always with code pretty much. That's pretty much how I'm always creating art nowadays. Using some kind of programming or maybe using some kind of system or like some sort of autonomous type of mechanical thing. But primarily it's code with JavaScript. That's what I tend to work with. And yeah, there's sometimes like months where I'm just sort of wanting to create work, wanting to create images, wanting to create sort of outputs. And then there's some months where that kind of creative sort of drive is depleted and it sort of shifts into more like tools and like building open source sort of code and building like projects that maybe other creative coders or generative artists can actually take advantage of. And so for the last 2 years, I'd say I've been in more of like an art building mode, but I can feel myself beginning to want to sort of go back to that tool building mode. And in those sort of tool building phases, I'll just be working on like open source tools that most people don't understand because most people aren't having to like actually work with these kind of systems. And so, yeah, that's kind of how my process goes. It's sort of this like balance between...
You listen to music when you code?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. I've gone through phases where I'll listen to like a lot of music where I code, and sometimes I'll try podcasts, but then sometimes I'm like listening too much to the podcast, and now it's like I've been in this weird like just quietness, and then other times I'll actually go to a very loud space like a bar, and it's amazing somehow I can like focus in a bar.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Subscapes and Meridians and now Folio. Like I'm thinking, what were you listening to when you were deep in the trenches there?
For Folio, I'd say a lot of 80s music. So yeah, just like this playlist of 80s music on repeat. And I think you'll get a sense of that as you see the exhibition tonight.
So I'll go back a little bit and think about your genesis. Very fortunate to have your parents here. Got to talk to your mom a little bit. According to her, your grandfather was a big collector of the Group of Seven. Canadian landscape painters from the 20s and 30s. Do you have any recollection? Was that influential for you? Do you remember that?
Honestly, no. But
I tried.
But I do remember like growing up a lot with art, sort of in my life, or at least creative things like just doing craft projects and like putting things together. And I think a lot of the influence actually is probably, sorry, Mom, but it's more on the dad side with like working with computers from an early age and actually playing, Doom or Myst, and then having to load those computer games. At the time, it wasn't as simple as like just installing something and double clicking a button. It was more like running like the command terminal and actually entering these commands and like having to, find where the executable is within like the file system and things like that. And I think that's where it started to get me thinking about code. And then sometimes I'd be, maybe wanting to like modify the game or sort of hack the game or like just try and break it in some ways. Or when games like RuneScape came around, it was a lot of like, how can you like create a bot or how can you like create a script? And eventually it just continued into full-blown programming, specifically programming around media and programming around like games or art or sort of graphics programming. And then from that, I sort of slowly drifted more into like generative art and just trying to produce art fully with code rather than graphics for a game or something like that.
You wanted to be an animator?
I had moments where I wanted to be an animator. I had moments where I wanted to be a game designer, or game developer, or something in film maybe, because I studied film. Once I finished film studies at Queen's in Canada, at that point, film was kind of hard to break into, and really I was spending all my weekends just programming for fun. So why am I still trying to get into film when I can just continue programming? And that's kind of how I ended up here.
You want to talk a little bit about Wayfinder?
So for those who don't know, Wayfinder was a collaboration with the National Film Board of Canada, and it was a very large project. It was like a 3-year project, basically, from like pitch to like actual like development and like design work and things like that, where the NFB approached me and they said, what would you do if you wanted to do a project with NFB? And at the time, I was really into this sort of peaceful, meditative type games, and I wasn't playing a lot of them, but I was kind of imagining that I would like to play a lot of them, and I was kind of imagining that I would like to see more games like that, and I'd like to see some that weave in elements of like poetry and elements of sort of this kind of like contemplative, meditative feeling without it necessarily being something that is so explicitly like a game that you have to beat or that you have to win or that you have to, compete at or something like that. And without it being anything really like a game, almost more like a piece of artwork that just you can play through your browser. And so we built this project. It was a couple of animators and illustrators, Tiffany Burscher and Guillaume Leroux, and they were fantastic at sort of putting together this like artistic style. And then we had sound designer. We had a couple other developers helping, and it was this massive couple-year project. And yeah, you can play it if you search NFB Wayfinder. I think it's the exact URL is wayfinder.nfb.ca, and it's just a short game that you can play in your browser, and it's free. And it's been, that was a big project. But after that, there was a bit of a burnout, I'd say, from like just spending too much time coding, and it was kind of nice to get back to just creating sort of more expressionist, abstract work with code rather than trying to create a sort of functional working experience that doesn't just break every time a user taps it too many times or something like that.
You went to school with another generative artist, didn't you? William Mappin?
I didn't go to school with William, no. So
William
was actually working on Wayfinder for a short little while at the end. I needed some help with some of the development around some of the more like flourishing touches and the visual stuff, and William and I connected on that, and he helped just kind of like tie some things together. There's sort of this group of sort of, I don't know, designers, web creative people in London that are from this particular school in France called Gobelin School d'Image. And they are all very talented. And I think some of them have ended up on art blocks, and some of them are doing work, within the space and things like that as well, just whether it's design work or whether it's actually just generative art or something else, programming. So yeah, there's kind of this little bubble. And I think a lot of them used to live in London, but then when COVID hit, they all left London and went back to France, and they were like, goodbye.
I asked someone, I was at NFT New York, a French founder of a project, and he said because some of the greatest mathematicians are from France, and that's why there's so many great generative French artists. Do you buy that?
No.
Okay.
I don't know. I think a lot of it is that they, like in Paris and in some other French cities, they work together on projects. Like I see like a lot of like little working groups in even small cities in France where 5 of them will meet up and they'll start like sharing tips and techniques and things like that. Part of it is that there is this kind of culture that might have stemmed from schools like École d'Image, which is the Gobelin school, and a couple other schools in France that are really known for like design and creative work and illustration. And I think those have kind of like pushed France into this like very illustrative and creative and artistic sort of forefront, I guess. But it's still a very niche, I think. You know, it's a bit niche still. I don't think anywhere is bursting with generative artists. There's like
you said explosion before. It's exploding. It's bursting.
Yeah.
I want to shift a little bit to Folio now. So Folio refers to a single leaf of paper. Why did you choose the title?
It was a short, nice little title that felt like it kind of encapsulated some of the things that I'm working on in this project. So Folio is not just sort of computer drawing. It's not just like a generative artwork that you view in your browser or something. It's more of a system that is intended to produce an output process that you can apply in a variety of different media. So when I say output process, I mean kind of like it's giving you steps or instructions as to how you can create work from those steps and instructions. And every time the software runs, it produces a totally different set of steps and instructions. In this case here, it's basically giving an output process that says, use this paper color, this beige paper color, and then fill one layer with black with this particular layout of text or typographic sort of glyphs, and then fill with white with this particular set of white glyphs. And you'll start to see when you're at the exhibition, you'll see screen prints and you'll see reso prints, and screen and reso printing really do sort of take advantage of this kind of multi-layer approach. And so a lot of it just kind of comes together with paper and like a single leaf of paper, but also kind of like a portfolio of paper, a portfolio of different outputs, a sort of assortment of different outputs. It just feels nice, and it's a short, easy sort of name for this project, yeah.
A couple things about the exhibit that people will see. One is you minted Mint Zero, and then you printed 100 versions of this. You want to talk about that decision?
Usually what would happen in art blocks and what would happen with like generative art on the blockchain kind of thing is that you would define an algorithm, you'd set this algorithm in stone, and you'd say, okay, this is the algorithm. You'd deploy it on the blockchain, and it would be fixed. You wouldn't be able to change it. And then once people start purchasing these tokens, the algorithm would basically run and produce whatever output is associated with that transaction hash. Nobody knows what the output is going to be. It's totally random. And there's kind of this complete unpredictability about it. It's kind of formed this idea of like long form generative art where the algorithm is sort of this singular thing that is just constantly running and producing new work. And it's a very different process than what I've been doing, I think, prior to blockchain and NFT type work. But one of there's a lot of interesting aspects to this kind of work. And it's really changed the way that a lot of generative artists are working. It's really forcing them to spend like 6 months on a single algorithm instead of like just bashing something out in a night and posting it on Twitter or Instagram or something. And in that sense, it's really elevating the work. And I think you can see that on like FX Hash and art blocks and stuff. But on the other hand, sometimes it's really nice to, as the artist and as the person who's crafted this set of instructions, you've been spending so much time with it that you actually know, I know if I push it a little harder, if I just like render a few more thousand or a few 100,000 maybe, I'll find that one gem that is really going to stand out from the rest. And so that's the aspect of like cherry picking a really good output from this algorithm. And when you're doing this long form generative art, you don't have that. And so with Folio, what I wanted to do is like an experiment where the first mint is cherry picked. I generated thousands and thousands and thousands of different outputs until I found one that was like the one that I wanted to represent as like the cover kind of.
How did you know?
Eventually you get tired of generating outputs. That's how you know.
Just
and
exhaustion.
Exhaustion. That's for me. I mean, you generate literally thousands and then you whittle it down and then you whittle those down and then eventually you end up with like 3 or 4 and then you just say, okay, you flip between the 3 or 4. That's my process. I'm sure other artists have a different process. And eventually I'm just like, I don't want to generate another 100,000 or something like that and just have to go through that whole thing again. Which sometimes you have to do if the code changes. And I had to do that a couple times on this because I'd make a last minute change. I'm like, oh God, I have to redo the whole thing. So basically with this, I actually got this one mint, and then that was the only one that was curated, that was cherry picked or sort of hand picked. And then the rest are going to be completely unpredictable, just as any other long form project. So it includes a bit of elements of the short form, sort of cherry picking or like choosing and curation, but it also includes elements of this kind of unpredictable outputs from this long form work.
When you say unpredictable, I mean, I'm interested in your process for designing an algorithm that's going to output 1,000 versus 100, right? And when you talk about unpredictable, like what might surprise you tonight?
There's a few things to keep an eye out for. So I think there's the sort of obvious surprise, which is, oh, this looks different than the last 10 or the last 20 that I've seen. And those, a lot of people say, oh, that's a grail because it's like, it's inverted or it's whatever, or it's like different. And that, yeah, it's a bit different. It's rare, whatever. It's like kind of unexpected, a bit unpredictable. But the most interesting things for me is where the algorithm actually surprises me as somebody who's been looking at this work for, a long time now and has seen most of the iterations, but every once in a while, the sort of chaos will come together. And I like to think of it as like serendipity, where it's just these, certain text will line up in such a way that it almost spells something, or that, things overlap in such a way that you're like, I really did not expect this thing to produce this output. In some sense, it's like, those are the ones that I want to highlight and share. But it would also not be fair to put that as mint zero because it's not representative of really the work as a whole. It's just representative of like this one unique gem that you possibly could have found within this like massive parameter space. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things around this. But I also think we were getting away from like the screen printing thing, which I never talked about. But basically this whole idea was to select and curate a single mint zero and then actually produce screen prints from that. So I had to select that mint zero some time ago in order to get the screen prints like completely ready. And so then the process was to use the output process, not just the image or the PNG, but to use the program which spits out multiple different layers for each ink that has to be screen printed. I don't know if anyone's familiar with screen printing, but you're basically creating this mesh. It's like a wire mesh that's like really fine little mesh, and you're dropping ink through it. But before you do that, you have to like create a mask that's like a silhouette of your design, and then you just squeegee, like pull the ink through onto the surface. But in order to do that, you can only do one ink color at a time. And that's kind of also, you'll start to see through Folio, is that it's really just composed of 2 or 3 colors. But yeah, I had to get those sort of prepared for tonight. And so that's kind of the big physical component of Folio, is these 100 limited edition, just like 100 of limited edition run of screen prints. And yeah, the minters will be able to sort of carry those home if they want.
The other big
that covers it.
physical piece is what you referred to as the FOLIO Computer System. You want to talk about the terminal and the choice and kind of where your head is at in terms of like live minting as a performance versus people at home remotely behind their screens minting.
Yeah, so this was another really interesting thing with this exhibition, is that it's not just somebody doing a transaction on their browser and 5 minutes later seeing the image on their phone or something like that, but it's how can we actually bring this into this physical space. And so the live minting aspect of Folio is kind of its own beast, to be honest. It's a whole other project within this project. Yeah, there's lots of secret little things. It's basically a computer system within the gallery. FOLIO Computer System is what I'm calling it.
FCS.
Very simple name. Yeah, it's really modeled after some of the more analog, old school 80s retro sort of computing technology, and you'll definitely get a sense of that. And it's really meant to highlight this aspect that the algorithm is not just like an image or a PNG or whatever. It's really a system that's running, and it's running in real time, and you can kind of manipulate the system, and you can see how every time it generates a new output, it's able to like generate this within seconds. And probably the most interesting thing I think for around generative art is that every single output that you see that's just generated if you reload the page or refresh the algorithm or rerun the software, the next time you see that image, it's going to be completely new and completely unique, and it's going to be an image that nobody else has ever seen before. And also it's going to be that the last image you just saw is kind of erased from any memory, because unless you've recorded the hash, unless you've recorded the state of the program and even the code itself, unless you've done those things, then you're going to completely lose that output, and you're never going to be able to create that output again with the code. And so that's kind of one of the concepts here with Folio and with the Folio Computer System, is that it's constantly producing new work. It's constantly just creating new work that then basically gets almost erased or just disappears into the ether, and like you can't really capture that work again. So you might have recorded it on your phone, but you know, it's very unlikely that you'd have the full hash and that you'd be able to recover that. And so it's kind of just talking a bit about this idea that generative art is always producing work that is always disappearing. But with the blockchain, one of the things that's kind of interesting is we can actually preserve this input hash and this state and even the code itself on the blockchain in this distributed ledger that is, you know, in theory, very permanent, a very permanent place to store these kind of small bytes of data. And that's kind of the theory of the whole minting process within Folio, is how it's recording and preserving an input hash and a very limited number of just 100 input hashes that will make up the final sort of preserved state of this computer algorithm that would otherwise just continue to run forever and ever and ever.
I love that. And as people will see, there's not a ton of screens in the exhibit, right? That you chose to print subscapes. Kind of talk to me like what works best printed, what works best on screen, and why? I
like projectors because they feel there in the room with you, and they have this kind of, you know, they have a sound, and you can see the dust and the volumetric light and things like that. They feel very analog. I'm not a huge fan of screens as a display mechanism for art, and I know a lot of exhibitions and a lot of galleries are exploring that with NFTs and things, because that just seems like that's what you would do if you've got a bunch of NFTs and you don't know how to display them. Well, you just throw them all on a screen. But it kind of doesn't do justice to most work, especially most generative work, I think, because one of the beauties with generative art is that it's running in real time, and very often it's able to run at any dimension. And that means if you scale it up to something like a massive print that's like a couple meters tall, it can still produce extremely crisp edges. It can actually be generated exactly for that, you know, exact millimeter size print, which is very different than most other formats and most media that we work with. So I'd say print is a kind of excellent way to display, but also I don't think it should be limited just to only having, you know, digital inkjet prints of a generative artwork, because it's hard to say that, well, this generative artwork is only going to be represented by these prints, because really it could be represented by, you know, this other type of printing mechanism like reso printing or screen printing, which is sort of what I'm exploring here, is to say that this singular algorithm is able to produce much more than just a JPEG, much more than just a print. And those are just ways that we can try and visualize what the system is doing. But ultimately, there's not really any, you know, solid way to visualize a generative system. It's just, we're just trying to render it out in different ways. But kind of the beauty of it is actually the system itself, which is what I'm trying to like push with this whole Folio Computer System thing and the sort of mainframe room and things like that.
Cool. What projects, protocols, artists are you most interested and excited about now?
I mean, I'm really interested in what's happening on like Tezos with FX hash, and even like just very weird experimental stuff like typed.art, where people are sort of posting typed messages and typed ASCII art to the blockchain and things like that. And also I have a few like artists that I often, you know, like to reference that are some of my faves. Like Def Beef's work is amazing for those who have seen it. He's creating audio-visual programs in just C, the programming language C, and then he'll upload the entire thing to the blockchain. And his idea is that because the blockchain, the EVM, actually needs C to compile, that's probably the most robust programming language that will survive 1,000 years into the future or whatever. And so his work is very conceptual in the sense that like you would One of them is called entropy, and every time the token transfers, the artwork degrades. And so over time, if you've transferred it 10 times, the artwork just becomes this kind of signal glitched sort of output that, you know, the sound is glitched and the visuals are glitched. So it's a lot of really interesting conceptual work within this blockchain space. And I think there's others like Ria Myers and Sarah Friend that are also doing this kind of conceptual work within blockchain that I think is really interesting.
It's also just a juxtaposition with, on the one hand, you're trying to capture the perfect output of the algorithm, and at the same time with Def Beef or with Matt Cain, you've got these NFTs that evolve over time. Or even with Sputniko last week, it's going to continue to grow for 6 months or a year.
Mm-hmm.
What about some of your own hacks, like the, as I call it, the seed phrase mnemonic poetry maker? Can you describe that?
Yeah, that's been a fun thing lately. I've been really exploring how to embed private keys into my work. I think there's something really interesting with blockchain, which is basically just that there's this concept of private keys that can be turned into public addresses. It's kind of this mind-blowing thing where if you know the exact private key, then you just have access to that address, to that account on the network. And it's something where you can generate a private key by just generating 12 or 24 random words that are within this dictionary. And if you do that enough times, if you generate enough, you'll actually get the exact same private key that I might have used to mint Folio, or you'll get somebody else's private key. But because there's so many potential variations with using a 24 word sort of seed phrase, it's literally going to take you a bajillion years in order to actually generate enough times to happen upon the exact public address and the exact private key that I used to mint this work. So there's kind of a lot of this interesting stuff within just this idea of seed phrases and within the spec that most wallets are using, which is this BIP39 spec of these 2048 specific words. And you can take those words and you can assemble them into like a poem, like a haiku poem or something like that. And if you assemble them in such a way that the final word is kind of the specific word that sort of matches and this algorithm can run on it, basically you can create a wallet from a haiku piece of poetry, and you can then give somebody a piece of poetry, and that poem can actually enable them access to a public wallet on the blockchain, which might have tokens in it, might have an NFT in it. So some of the work I've been sort of exploring is, instead of just doing a typical drop and selling the work, I'd say, well, the work is here, it's free to access, anybody can access it if they solve this puzzle. And so for the next hour, many people come together to try and solve the puzzle to figure out what is the actual poem that's creating this work, kind of, or what's the poem behind this work. Because as soon as they find that poem, then they have access to the wallet and they can withdraw the NFT and they basically win the NFT. It's a bit of a puzzle, it's a bit of a game, but it's also sort of commenting on just seed phrases and
teaching and educating.
Yeah, and also educating and trying to show some of the risks actually of this as well. And if you, as soon as the seed phrase is publicly known, it is a compromised wallet. So like as soon as I publish the artwork that might have this poem that's encoded in a certain cipher or encoded in a certain way, I have to consider that wallet as compromised, and I can't put any value in it that I don't want to see gone, because within an hour, somebody is probably going to capture that. And I think it's going to be interesting if I keep doing this over the course of the next few years. People are going to start building like bots. As soon as I create a new work, they're going to start like scanning thousands of poetry data sets to try and understand like, okay, how is this poem? And it's just like, it's a fascinating world, and it's fun to sort of play with, and it's kind of combining, a bit of like poetry, a bit of blockchain, a bit of code, a bit of generative things. So, yeah.
There's also money involved. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you think about the financialization of all this and floor prices and Because that is kind of the elephant in the room.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. It's a lot of talk about what's this floor, what's that floor, and then I try to just, it's not a very exciting conversation. So eventually those conversations kind of piddle out, and I find it tends to, the more interesting things tend to go back to what's the work and, what are people doing with this, or what are people creating. And so, that's my answer, I guess.
You talked a little bit about, I want to open up to questions pretty soon. You talked a little bit about FX Hash, and we had Proof of People here last week. And I think it seems to me that artists, you, Casey, Marcelo, a number of artists are really comfortable going back and forth between Tez and ETH, between art blocks and FX Hash. I think collectors get a little bit more tribal because there may be a little bit more challenge going between chains because of their bags or whatever. Like, how do you see the evolution of both of those platforms, among others, over the next year, a couple of years?
Mm-hmm. So originally, when I started minting on FX or on Hic and Nunc on Tezos, I was really considering it as like, I think these tokens might be gone next month because it was such a broken website. And over time it got better. And then the community started to build other sites like Taya and Versum and a bunch of others. And so it started to become clear that there's actually something on Tezos that doesn't exist on ETH. And even if Ethereum goes to hopefully it'll go to proof of stake this year. And if it does, I think some people on Tezos might start to say, oh, well, now it's proof of stake, so I could sort of consider that. But even then, I think there's not going to be a massive shift over. I think a lot of the people that are creating work on Tezos and creating platforms on Tezos are going to just keep doing that. And so I think Tezos does have a long future, and some of the work that they're doing as like a engineering for the actual chain itself is really interesting. So I think
Do you think one is friendlier to artists?
Tezos, because the gas fees are so low for sure. So with Tezos, it's like you mint something and it costs you like 0.01 cents or something like that. And then right now on Ethereum, it's fairly cheap. It's like $10 or something. But sometimes if it's really congested, it could be $100 or something. So Tezos is far more artist friendly, and the community of Tezos is, it's very like community vibe. It's like people are wanting to help each other, just gift each other work, and really support each other. And it's also, it seems a little bit less focused on like floor prices and things like that. It's more like the work itself, and people are doing weird performances and weird conceptual art and things like that. So it's a lot more experimental, a lot more playful. And I think it'll probably stick around for a while. And I think it'll be a good model for what a lot of Ethereum platforms might actually want to do. Just like on FX Hash, they have a lot of work around collaborations and splitting that are built into the contracts. And those are things that I think some of the Ethereum platforms should really be looking at more.
Do you think Artblock should support Tez? Could it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I guess it could. I don't know. That's probably not in their interest. Like I think they're pretty one track, but it's interesting. I don't know. Maybe.
It's like the Protestants and the Catholics, the Jews, it's all sorts of tribal.
Might be.
We'll see. Maybe now's a good time to open it up to questions.
Yeah. This question actually came up in my head when you were talking about making the screen prints. I know you've created tools in the past for, artists and collectors to reformat their work or, size it up or down. If somebody wanted to do that and create a screen print for this, is there a tool that you'd plan to release that would give them the outputs to create a template or shell that they could then, play around with?
Yep. So the work, the actual code itself that's on chain, you can add basically parameters to it, and you can do that through your browser, and you can just add a certain part of the URL, and it will generate the first layer or the second layer or the third layer, which is the actual different layers you'd need to produce these screen prints. So yeah, totally, it should be just, you don't even need a separate tool. It's just the code itself that's on chain. And all of the screen prints and all of the printed material that I've worked with is just using the code itself that's on chain. It's not like any wrapper code around it or anything like that.
So it seems like most of your work is still like a still, not image, it's live running code, but it's still, I guess, what's your thought process behind that? And do you have any kind of desire to work on more animated works?
Yeah, so it's funny because a lot of things that I've worked on before NFTs was actually a lot of interactive, animated, because the main mode of delivery was just, here's a link on Twitter, go check it out kind of thing. And now there's this it's more about like preservation. So Subscapes was one of the first big projects I did, and the idea was really something that could be preserved on-chain, that didn't need to change with new browser, versions or anything like that, and that would also work in a headless environment like Node.js. So if people wanted to use a pen plotter to produce these kind of works, they could run the exact same on-chain script. And so I was really thinking about how do I create work that will sort of survive many years. And with animation, it gets a lot more complicated. You end up with a lot of considerations around how the browser is going to render it, how fast it's going to be, how it's going to be across different platforms, different devices, and things like that. So I kind of stepped away from animation. And to be honest, I actually have been finding a lot of love for printed and analog material, and it's rarely animation. So I think I'm more interested in like the more static work. That's just what I think I've been gravitating towards. But also with Folio and with the Folio Computer System, you're going to start to see that there's some interesting ways of potentially displaying textual work or maybe even more graphical work. But this is getting me thinking again about how do I display animations, but not just as a animation in a browser, but maybe on an analog, more like a screen that's based on just a single laser or a single sort of signal that's just able to generate animations, like an oscilloscope or something like that. But yeah, I haven't really figured out the full extent of the animations yet.
I'm curious about your artistic or cultural inspirations, not just for this collection, but for just in a general sense.
Mm-hmm. Recently, it's been a lot of inspiration from poetry and a lot of inspiration from concrete and visual poetry. And that's really showing, I think, in Folio, but also in some of the seed poetry work that I've been exploring, and some of the other like little sketches I've been doing. So definitely like visual poetry and concrete poetry is fascinating. And I've lately been getting more interested in constrained poetry as well, where you set up some set of constraints and sort of a system, and then you try to create poetry within that set of constraints. But besides that, there's also just, I'm kind of fascinated by early computer art and the history of computer art. And I think I'm interested in, these older systems and these analog systems. And sometimes it's, with some projects, it's a bit more like inspired by nature, maybe inspired by the way that rock strata falls or by the way that like a cellular structure grows or something like that. But those are my main sources of inspiration. And then, I don't know, did you mean like artists or did you mean just whatever?
Artists or
okay.
pop culture stuff that you like.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say pop culture stuff. I don't know. Maybe I've been watching too much Stranger Things lately and it's been just bleeding into my mind. But yeah.
As you've gotten closer to these glyphs and these like text elements, and we spend so much time texting and with emojis, like I see like question marks. Are there certain characters that you found more meaning as you've gone deeper into the project?
Yeah, well, actually, just riffing on that a bit more, is that one of the things that I've also been really kind of, I don't know, I've been, I guess, naturally going towards this, not trying to go towards this, but it's like it ends up being the case with something like Meridian and with this project, is that it has this woven textile feel to it. And a lot of this kind of inspiration actually comes from artists like Annie Albers, and those working with early like jacquard woven techniques. And that's kind of an area that I've also been really inspired and interested in. And I think it's fascinating how it has this like full circle with art history, because some of the earliest jacquard looms back in the 1800s were using these wooden punched cards that had holes in them that were in different formations, and you would set up the jacquard loom with these different punch cards, and you just run this automated machine, and it would just produce different designs based on the punch cards you used. And then in the 1900s, when computers came around, they said, well, we need a way of automating these systems and sort of programming them, so we're going to use this punch card system that's directly inspired by jacquard loom weaving. So it's got this kind of like full circle. It's also just like this beautiful sort of, I like this textural quality. And I think that's something I've been exploring a lot in the recent work.
What role do you assign to the technology that you use in your creation? Do you see it merely as a tool of creating, or do you see technology more as a collaborator in your process?
Definitely a collaborator. With something like generative work and just creative coding, and I mean especially these works where you're creating a singular output and you're just constantly seeing this new output from that code. It becomes a bit of a collaboration because you start with a certain direction in mind. You might have a sketch of what you want to achieve, or you might have like a rough idea of something, and then quite often what will happen is the computer will show you something different. You've maybe programmed it wrong, or you've forgotten about an edge case, or there's a bug, or just like the way that the randomness lines up is like, you're like, wow, that looks way better than what I initially thought I was going to do. And so you go down that road instead, and then you're constantly going down these different branches and sub-branches every time the computer introduces you something unexpected. So it's definitely a collaboration rather than just like a pure tool. Like something like Photoshop, I don't have that moment as much where I'm like, oh my God, Photoshop just showed me the best way I could change this design. It doesn't happen. It's more just like, yeah, you have to show it. So it's an interesting collaboration, I think.
Yeah, I love my Meridian, and I just wanted to ask you, I see some commonalities in the color palettes between what I'm seeing on the screen and well across the Meridians that I've seen. Could you tell us a bit more about your process?
It's funny because there's not, like maybe it was a subconscious or unintentional, but I wasn't intending to create too many color palettes here that are matching Meridian. Most of these are using colors that are sort of picked from Rezo color palettes or from screen color inks that are the base like very primary spectral colors that you'd be provided with if you were to go to a screen printer or a Rezo printer. Rezo printing is this specific technique for printing where you have to load these drums of ink into this specific Rezo printing machine, and most places will just say, oh, these are our 8 different Rezo colors, and those are the only colors you can choose. So it's like red, blue, green, whatever, and there are these very specific sort of hues of red or whatever, and that's where most of the folio colors is coming from. Because I really wanted to focus on this idea of like either Rezo or screen printing, where it's like one layer color and another layer color, and as they composite and they blend, they produce new colors. So it's funny that you say that there are similarities. I think it's partly unintentional in that a lot of the color palettes that I gravitate towards and a lot of the sort of combinations that I gravitate towards, I guess, have similar feelings. And with something like Meridian, like the prismatic palettes are very colorful and very like almost retro in a way, and maybe that sort of comes through in Folio as well, these old school palettes. And I think it's old school because, you know, these are techniques that have been around for a long time now. Like Rezo printing is quite old, and that's where when you look at a Rezo print, it kind of gives you this feeling of a bit more analog and a bit more something that isn't the same as what you see on your mobile phone.
I want to end with a quick flash round. Are we ready?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you to like just be ready, close your eyes. I'm gonna give you 5 different names or themes, and I want you to just give me a couple words in response. Are you ready?
Yeah. Ready.
One's thanks to Tony. Ready? CryptoPunks.
Pixelated.
Tyler Hobbs.
Fidenza.
Utility.
Token.
6529.
Punk.
MoMA.
White walls. I don't know.
That's it. That's all we get. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say thanks so much also to Bright Moments for putting this whole thing on. Like the amount of work that their whole team has been doing for the last several days, but also on all the other projects.
Raise your hand. Juan, Chan, if you're part of Bright Moments, Luke, just we're all here to support
Thank
you,
you
Matt.
so much, guys. It's been amazing working with you. So.
You turned us down a couple times. It took a little while to get this going, but I really appreciate you. It's been great to have your family here, and just what's particularly gratifying to me, and I think the team, is like when we create a place for generative artists who've been working primarily online behind your screen to not only engage people IRL, but to actually, in your case, work with us in the gallery and choosing where things go and creating a physical experience. It's really thrilling, and it gives us a lot of joy and a lot of energy. So thank you.